7. Lasalle's agitation. In July, 1862, at a time when the Marx family was in the severest straits, Lasalle made his return visit to London. In order to maintain certain doubt towards him, my wife had to take practically everything that wasn't actually nailed down to the pawnshop, wrote Marx to Engels. Lasalle had no idea how desperate the situation was, and he accepted the appearances Marx and his wife presented at their face value, and the careful housekeeper, Lincoln de Muth, never forgot the visitor's hearty appetite. Thus a horrible situation developed, and it is really no reproach to Marx, particularly as Lasalle's attitude was not over-modest at any time, that he could not quite overcome the feelings which once caused Schiller to say of Goethe, "How easily this man achieves all things, and how hard I have to fight for everything." Only on his departure after a stay of several weeks does Lasalle seem to have realized the situation, and he then offered his assistance, declaring that by the end of the year he could provide £15 and that Marx could also draw bills on him to any amount, providing that Engels or someone else would stand good for them. With the assistance of Borkim, Marx then tried to obtain $400 in this way. But Lasalle wrote a letter making his agreement dependent on a written undertaking by Engels to place him in possession of the necessary sum at least 8 days before the bill fell due, in order to guard against unforeseen circumstances. The lack of confidence displayed by Lasalle in Marx's personal guarantee was naturally hurtful. But Engels urged Marx not to get excited about such foolishness and immediately gave the required undertaking. The subsequent development of this financial arrangement is not quite clear. On the 29th of October, Marx wrote to Engels that Lasalle was very angry with him and had demanded that the covering sum should be sent to his private address as he had no banker. On the 4th of November, Marx wrote that Freiligrath was ready to send the $400 to Lasalle, and the next day Engels answered that he would send £60 to Lasalle tomorrow. But at the same time they both referred to a prolongation of the bill. Something must have gone wrong in this connection, for on the 24th of April, 1864, Lasalle declared to a third party that he had not written to Marx for 2 years because for financial reasons their relations were strained. He had in fact last written to Marx at the end of 1862, sending him a copy of his pamphlet What Now? This letter is no longer extant, but in a letter to Engels on the 2nd of January, 1863, Marx declared that it was a request for the return of a book. In a further letter to Engels on the 12th of June, Marx severely criticized Lasalle's agitation in Germany and wrote, "Since the beginning of the year I have not been able to bring myself to write to the fellow." According to this letter, therefore, Marx broke off his correspondence with Lasalle for political reasons. However, there is not necessarily any real contradiction between the two versions, for one thing may very well have coincided with the other. The extremely uncomfortable circumstances under which the two men last met probably contributed to aggravating their political differences, which had certainly not grown less since Marx's visit to Berlin, to say the least of it. In the autumn of 1861 Lasalle had visited Switzerland and Italy. In Zurich he had made the acquaintance of Rusto, and on the island of Caprera that of Garibaldi, and whilst in London he had visited Mazzini. He seems to have been interested in a somewhat fantastic plan of the Italian party of action, according to which Garibaldi should land his volunteers in Dalmatia and from there proceed to raise the standards of revolt in Hungary. This plan was never carried into execution, and Lasalle makes no written references to it anywhere. At the utmost it was probably no more than a fleeting idea, for he had quite different affairs in his head, and even before he visited London he had begun to carry his own plans into execution. The winning of Marx as an ally was of far greater importance to him than all the Italian notions, but Marx proved even less approachable than he had been the year before. Lasalle still harbored the idea of founding a paper, but Marx declared that although he was prepared to act as its English correspondent in return for good pay, he would not take any share of the responsibility, political or otherwise, because he disagreed with Lasalle in everything except a few far-off and ultimate aims. He also showed himself no less opposed to the plans Lasalle laid before him for agitation amongst the workers. He declared that Lasalle let himself be influenced too much by the immediate circumstances of the moment. Lasalle wanted to oppose a pygmy like Schulze Delitzsch as the focus of his agitation, state aid against self-help. With this he was merely resuscitating the slogan which the Catholic socialist bookers had used against the real working class movement in France in the 40s. When adopting the Chartist demand for the general franchise, Lasalle had overlooked the difference between English and German conditions, as well as the important lesson which the Second Empire had given the world in the question of franchise. By denying all natural connections with the earlier movement in Germany, he had fallen into the error of the sectarians, Proudhon's error, and instead of seeking the real basis in the genuine elements of the class movement, he sought to lay down the lines of development of the latter according to a certain dogmatic recipe. However, Lasalle did not permit himself to be disheartened by these criticisms, and he continued his agitation as a purely working-class movement from the spring of 1863 on. He still hoped to be able to convince Marx of the value of his work, and even after they had ceased corresponding he sent Marx his agitational material regularly, though its reception at Marx's hands was hardly what he had hoped for. In his letters to Engels, Marx condemns Lassalle's activities with a severity which occasionally develops into bitter injustice. It is not necessary to go into the unpleasant details here, and they can be read in the correspondence between Marx and Engels. Sufficient to say that the writings which have since given new hope and new life to hundreds of thousands of German workers were flung contemptuously on one side by Marx as the plagiarisms of a schoolboy, when he read them at all, and as juvenile exercises not worth reading even to kill time, when he did not read them. Only shallow-pated Pharisees will attempt to gloss over these facts with the foolish remark that as Lassalle's teacher, Marx had the right to treat him in such a fashion. Marx was not a superman, and he never pretended to be anything more than a man, declaring that nothing human was foreign to him. The thoughtless repetition of the ideas of others was one of the things which annoyed him intensely. In justice to him, it is as necessary to repair the wrong he did to others as it is to repair the wrong others did to him. His figure gains more in fact by an unprejudiced criticism of his relations to Lassalle than it would if we were to follow the example of his all too orthodox adherents and plod along the path he laid down, looking neither to left nor right and, to quote Lessing, carrying his carpet slippers. In one sense Marx was certainly Lassalle's teacher, and in another sense he was not. From one point of view Marx might have said of Lassalle what Hegel is alleged to have said on his deathbed about his own pupils: only one of them understood me, and he misunderstood me. Lassalle was incomparably the most brilliant adherent Marx and Engels won during their lives, but he never fully grasped the alpha and omega of their New World outlook, historical materialism. Marx was quite right when he declared that Lassalle was unable to free himself from the speculative conception of Hegelian philosophy. Although he thoroughly grasped the tremendous historical importance of the proletarian class struggle, he understood it only in those idealist forms of thought which were peculiar above all to the bourgeois epoch, in the philosophical and legal forms. The result was that, as an economist, Lassalle did not approach Marx in stature, and either failed to grasp the full significance of the latter's economic teachings or misunderstood them altogether. Marx occasionally judged him too leniently in this respect, though more often his strictures were too severe. Referring to Lassalle's presentation of the Marxian theory of value, Marx observed mildly that Lassalle had fallen victim to considerable misunderstandings. Whereas it would have been nearer the truth to declare roundly that he had failed to understand it at all, Lassalle adopted only that part of Marx's theory of value which fitted in with his own legalist and philosophic way of looking at the world. The proof that general social labor time, which determined value, made general social production necessary in order to secure for the worker the full product of his toil. For Marx, however, the theory of value represented the solution of all the mysteries of the capitalist mode of production. It was a key to the formation of value and surplus value as a historical process which would inevitably change the capitalist order of society into a socialist one. Lassalle overlooked the difference between labor power which results in use value and labor power which results in exchange value, the double nature of labor embodied in commodities, which for Marx was the vital point on which an understanding of political economy depended. The real difference between the two is revealed at this decisive point. It is the difference between the legalist philosophical outlook and the economic materialist outlook. In other economic questions Marx judged Lassalle's weaknesses all too harshly, and particularly the two main economic pillars of Lassalle's agitation: the iron law of wages, so called by Lassalle, and the workers' cooperatives working with state credit. Marx declared that Lassalle had borrowed the one from the English economists, Malthus and Ricardo, and the other from the French Catholic socialist, Boucas, although as a matter of fact Lassalle had taken them both from the Communist Manifesto, on the basis of the theory of population put forward by Malthus, according to which population always increases more quickly than the production of foodstuffs. Ricardo developed his law that the average wage must limit itself to the amount necessary, generally speaking, to support bare existence and the perpetuation of the race. Lasalle never accepted this justification of the law of wages by an alleged natural law, and he opposed the population theory of Malthus just as energetically as did Marx and Engels. He insisted on the iron character of the law of wages only for capitalist society, under present-day conditions, under the rule of supply and demand. And in this he was only following in the footsteps of the Communist Manifesto. Lasalle had been dead 3 years before Marx proved the elastic character of the law of wages as it develops at the height of capitalist society, finding its highest level in the necessity for the utilization of capital and its lowest level in that depth of poverty which a worker can just tolerate without dying of starvation. Within these limits wage levels are not determined by the natural fluctuations of population, but by the degree of resistance which the workers offer to the steady tendency of capital to squeeze as much unpaid labor as possible out of their labor power. After this, the organization of the working class in trade unions was seen to have a far greater significance than Lasalle had been prepared to grant it. In this respect, therefore, Lasalle was merely behind Marx in economic insight, but with regard to his productive associations, he fell into a serious error. He did not borrow them from bookers and he did not regard them as a panacea for all social evils, but as a step towards the socialization of production. In the same connection, the Communist Manifesto mentions the centralization of credit in the hands of the state and the founding of state factories, together with a number of other measures. But at the same time it declares that these measures appear economically insufficient and untenable. But in the course of the movement they outstrip themselves and are unavoidable as a means of entirely revolutionizing the mode of production. On the other hand, Lasalle regarded his productive associations as the organic seed, unfolding from within and inevitably driving forward all further development. Here he certainly betrayed an infection with French socialism when he assumed that the laws of commodity production could be liquidated on the basis of commodity production. His economic weaknesses, which can be referred to only in their main points here, were certainly calculated to upset Marx, who observed him throwing into confusion again what he, Marx, had already laboriously solved. If Marx had contented himself with an energetic and even angry protest, his attitude would have been understandable. But in his justifiable annoyance he failed to observe that Lasalle's policy was fundamentally his own, despite all Lasalle's theoretical misunderstandings. Marx himself had always been in favor of seizing on the extremist edge of an existing movement as a lever to impel it still further forward, and this is what he did in 1848. Lasalle was therefore no more influenced by the immediate circumstances of the moment than Marx himself had been in the revolutionary years. Lasalle is accused of sectarianism and of denying all natural connections with the earlier movement in Germany. But this is true only insofar as Lasalle never mentioned either the Communist League or its manifesto in his agitation. And it is just as true that in the several hundred numbers of the Neue Rheinische Zeitung there is just as little reference to either of them. After the death of both men, Engels indirectly, but nevertheless strikingly, justified Lasalle's tactics. In the years 1886-87 a proletarian mass movement began to develop in the United States with a very confused program, and Engels wrote to his friend Serge: "The first great step which must be taken in any country newly entering into the movement is to organize the workers into an independent political party, no matter how, providing it is a definite workers' party." And he went on to point out that if the program adopted by such a party was confused and even highly deficient, this was an inevitable and only temporary evil. He also wrote in a similar strain to other party friends in America, declaring that Marxist theory did not claim the monopoly of being the sole true dogma, but that it was the exposition of a process of development. One should not make the inevitable confusion of the first mobilization of working class forces worse confounded. By forcing the workers to swallow ideas which for the moment they were unable to digest, but which they would willingly accept later on. In support of his argument, Engels pointed to the attitude of Marx and himself in the revolutionary years in Germany. When we returned to Germany in the spring of 1848, we joined the Democratic Party as the only means of obtaining the ear of the working class. We were the most advanced wing of the party, but still we were a part of it. And just as the Neue Rheinische Zeitung had avoided all mention of the Communist Manifesto, so Engels warned the Americans against making it their immediate creed, pointing out that like almost all other minor works of Marx it was too difficult for the American workers to understand at the moment. They were coming into the movement for the first time and they were still somewhat clumsy and enormously backward in theoretical matters. We must use the practical everyday movement as a lever, and for this we need an entirely new literature. Once the American workers are more or less on the right path, the manifesto will not fail to have its effect. But at the moment it would influence only very few workers. And when Serge objected that the manifesto had exercised great influence on him when he had first read it, although he had been only a boy at the time, Engels replied, "You were Germans 40 years ago with the German capacity for theory, and therefore the manifesto had its effect on you, but although it was translated into English, French, Flemish, Danish, etc., it had absolutely no effect on the other peoples." By 1863, long years of leaden oppression had left very little of this capacity for theory amongst the German workers, and years of education were necessary before they again began to understand the manifesto. With regard to what Engels, appealing always and with complete justification to Marx, described as the first great step, Lasalle's agitation was beyond reproach. As an economist, Lasalle was undoubtedly far behind Marx, but as a revolutionary he was Marx's equal. Unless one cares to reproach him with the fact that his restless desire for revolutionary action outweighed the untiring patience of the scientific student. All his writings, with the one exception of Heraclitus, were written with a view to securing an immediate practical effect. He based his agitation on the broad and firm foundation of the class struggle, and he made its unswerving aim the conquest of political power by the working class. Marx's reproach that he sought to lay down the lines of development of the class struggle in accordance with a certain dogmatic recipe, was unjust, for Lasalle proceeded in fact from just those genuine elements which had naturally produced a movement amongst the German workers: the demand for the general franchise and the question of productive associations. His estimate of the general franchise as a lever of the proletarian class struggle was more correct than that of Marx and Engels, at least as far as his own day was concerned. And whatever may be said against his productive associations with state credit, they were nevertheless based on the correct fundamental idea that, to quote the words Marx himself used a few years later, in order to save the working people, cooperative labor must grow to national dimensions and logically therefore be supported by state means. Only as a result of the great and occasionally excessive admiration his followers had for him might Lasalle have appeared on the surface as a sectarian, but the real and original responsibility for this was at least not his, and he went to enough trouble to avoid the movement taking on the character of a one-man show in the eyes of the blockheads. He tried to win not only Marx and Engels, but also Butcher and Rodbertus. He did not succeed, and he found no equal to work with him. It was therefore natural enough when the gratitude of the workers occasionally took on the not very agreeable form of a Lasalle cult. On the other hand, it is also true that he was not the sort of man to hide his own light under a bushel, and he did not possess the self-effacement with which Marx always placed himself behind the cause. Another very important point remains to be considered, namely the apparently violent struggle of the liberal bourgeoisie against the Prussian government. It was out of this struggle that Lasalle's agitation developed. Since 1859, Marx and Engels had again been paying closer attention to German affairs, but, as their letters up to 1866 show in various ways, they did not always succeed in obtaining a correct grasp of the situation. Despite their experience in the revolutionary years, they still reckoned with the possibility of a bourgeois and even a military revolution. And as they overestimated the German bourgeoisie, so they underestimated the Greater Prussia policy. They never succeeded in overcoming the impressions of their youth, when their Rhenish homeland, proudly conscious of its modern culture, looked down with contempt on the old Prussian provinces. And the more they concentrated their attention on the Tsarist plans for world dominance, the more they came to regard the Prussian state as nothing but a Russian province. Even in Bismarck they were inclined to see no more than the tool of a Russian tool, the puppet of the mysterious man in the Tuileries, of whom they declared even in 1859 that he danced only to the tune of the Russian diplomatic pipe. The idea that the Greater Prussia policy might, for all its otherwise objectionable features, lead to results which would be equally unpleasant for Paris and St. Petersburg did not occur to them. They considered a bourgeois revolution in Germany to be still possible, and therefore they necessarily found Lasalle's agitation thoroughly out of tune with the developments. However, Lasalle saw things from close up, and his judgment was sounder. He based his policy on the assumption that the Philistine movement of the progressive bourgeoisie would never lead to anything, not even if we wait for centuries, for geological eras. And he was right. Once the possibility of a bourgeois revolution was excluded, he realized correctly that the unification of Germany, as far as it was possible at all, could only be the result of dynastic changes. and in his opinion the new Workers' Party should act as a driving wedge. He therefore opened up negotiations with Bismarck and attempted to entice the latter onto thin ice with his Greater Prussia policy. But he ventured too far himself, and although he did not violate his principles, he certainly did violate the exigencies of political tact, a proceeding which caused Marx and Engels to object strongly and with justification. In the last resort, what separated Marx and Engels from Lasalle in the years 1863-64 was opposing judgments on given conditions, and thus the appearance of personal rancor which seems to pervade the harsh judgments which Marx passed on Lasalle during these years must be discounted. However, Marx was never completely able to overcome his prejudice against the man whom the history of the German social democracy will always mention in the same breath with him and Engels. And even the mitigating power of death had no permanent effect. He received the news of Lasalle's death 6 from Freiligrath, and telegraphed it to Engels on the 3rd of September, 1864. The next day Engels answered, "You can imagine how the news surprised me. No matter what Lasalle may have been personally, and from a literary and scientific standpoint, politically he was certainly one of the finest brains in Germany. For us he was a very uncertain friend at the moment and would have been a fairly certain enemy in the future. But all the same it hits one hard to see how Germany is destroying all the more or less capable men of the extreme party. What joy there will be amongst the manufacturers and the progressive swine." After all, Lasalle was the only man in Germany of whom they were afraid. Marx let a few days pass, and then on the 7th of September he answered, "Lasalle's misfortune has been worrying me damnably during the last few days. After all, he was one of the old guard and an enemy of our enemies. But for all that I am sorry that our relations were so clouded during the past few years, although it was his fault. On the other hand, I am very glad that I resisted the incitement from various quarters and refrained from attacking him during his jubilee year. The devil take it. The group is becoming smaller and smaller and there are no reinforcements." In a letter of consolation to Countess Hatzfeldt he declared, "He died young, in battle, like Achilles." And when a little later the windbag blind tried to make himself important at Lasalle's expense, Marx crushed him with the contemptuous words, "I have no intention of trying to explain the character of a man like Lasalle and the real significance of his agitation to a grotesque clown with nothing behind him but his own shadow. In any case, I feel quite convinced that Herr Karl Blind is only obeying the dictates of his own nature when he spurns the dead lion." And a few years later in a letter to Schweitzer Marx praised the immortal service of Lasalle who, despite the great mistakes he made in his agitation, had awakened the German working class movement to life after a slumber of 15 years. Unfortunately, however, days came when he judged the dead Lasalle more bitterly and more unjustly than he had ever judged him during his lifetime. Thus an unpleasant residue remains and is resolved only in the inspiring thought that the modern working class movement is far too tremendous for any single brain, even the most powerful, to grasp it in its entirety.